Good morning. So, color plays an important role in rendering good architecture. How color and contrast, how color and contrast are put together? They are put together by having a very large area with a light color. Having a very large area with a light color and a small area with a dark color. If you put that, that's a contrast. That dark color, if you put on a larger area and put a light color in a smaller area, that light color cannot compete with the dark color because dark color will absorb the light. Dark colors will totally absorb the light. They will shrink the dimensions. As we have seen the horizontal composition and vertical composition, colors also will recede the dimensions. If they are dark, will enhance the dimension. These are all visual things, not actual. Visually enhance the dimension if they are painted with light colors. In which if you want to apply a contrast in a room, what will you do is you put larger area with a light color to reflect light, to induce more visual spaciousness, visual whiteness, visual enhancement, and to create a contrast because there will be monotony because you have only light colors everywhere that will create a visual monotony. To avoid that visual monotony and to induce a visual alertness, what you will put is you put a small area out of the whole area with a very dark color, a light color on a larger area and a band of dark color on a smaller area. Then that is a contrast. That contrast will give a visual feeling of balance. So even though it is a contrast, you get another creative principle using contrast known as balance. Balance, so a very wide area of light color will be balanced with a very small area of dark color. But that is not, the reverse is not true. If you use a very dark color over a larger area and a light color on a smaller area, balance cannot be achieved because contrast is not realized. Another use of contrast is another creative principle in architecture known as emphasis. Emphasis is another creative principle of architecture. To emphasize an object, you use colors. Emphasize. Suppose you want to know the hospital from a long distance. From a long distance, if you want to know that that is going to be a hospital, usually hospitals will be colored with white color. So if you see that white color on a very larger area, you can see that is a hospital. And there will be some monument or some historical uh, structure or a statue or a dome at the apex of the building. That will be colored in a particular appealing fashion, and that object will emphasize the whole structure. Even though the whole structure is spread over a very large area, people will first see that object at the apex of the structure, even though that is small in size. That is because you are emphasizing your center of vision or your axis of vision or your visual control gets focused on that object. This is happening in all cases of religious places. In all religious places, in a mosque, the domes, they emphasize, they convey their mass. In churches, you have the cross. Linear elements will be there with cross. So they emphasize, they say that the church. Similarly, in temples, you have the Gopuram with a front facade of the temple, with sculptures, with artistic rendering, with different colors. So they emphasize and they convey that it is a temple. Similarly, for all official firms, organizations, for post office, suppose you have post office, usually color is red. Red is the color. The post boxes, and if you see red. So they emphasize. For agricultural and greeneries, you have the green color, where you have agriculture operations. So wherever something concerned with sustainability, structures which are having sustainability, usually they'll be painted with green. Wherever you have an accident zone, architecturally it is conveyed by red color. So all accidents you convey with red color. So there the emphasis of by using color is to convey in advance the viewer that you are approaching that zone or approaching that zone. White is the most lightest color, white, and it is highly reflective. White is reflective, black is absorbing, black will absorb light, black will absorb heat, whereas white will reflect light and reflect heat. That is why people prefer white umbrella rather than a black umbrella. The cloth of the umbrella, white is preferred to black. But due to the maintenance problem, because white to maintain, because it is subjected to exposure of heat and rain, the white color will get faded in due course. Marshy, it will become marshy, dirty. So people go for black color considering the maintenance aspect. But as far as the functional aspect is concerned, white cloth for an umbrella is preferred to black cloth. So similarly, white color reflects, which will give you a feel of visual expansion. That is the white at that extreme. Black at this extreme, which will absorb light and heat. Gray is a neutral color. Gray is a neutral color. White is reflective, gray is neutral, black is absorptive. You have color wheel. Color wheel gives you, I told you, primary color from which you will get the secondary color. From the secondary color, you will go to the tertiary color. One such system of color wheel is called Munsell system. MUNSCLL. Munsell system of color wheel. That will give you how to combine two colors and to get a new color. So color, the role of color is to create contrast. Another way by which you can create contrast is by providing solids and voids. Solids and voids. Solid objects and void objects. For example, in the wall is totally a solid. If you say wall, it is a solid. The windows, the doors, the ventilators, they act as voids. The openings in any architectural forms are called voids. And the total opaque surface is called a solid. A contrast can be created by repeatedly using solids and voids. By repeatedly using solids and voids, you can create harmony you can create contrast. You can even then you can have a balance in the structure. Suppose in a house, if you have the door at the center, it is a center of vision. If you have openings on both sides, it creates duality. At the same time, you have a door, then some portion of wall, then you have the opening. So void, solid, void, solid, void. So harmoniously they go. You get a feeling of oneness. So duality is there, with the duality with the solid and void, but with respect to the axis of symmetry, the elements are same on both sides, which creates a unity. And since they are repeating in nature, it is harmonious. Usually in public buildings, in hostel buildings, this harmony is achieved because you will see a series of windows when you look at a public building. And this will be repeating in all the floors. So just to see that you will have many number of voids as windows and many number of voids as doors, and you will have solids in between them. So that will give you a feeling of harmony and contrast. And if you render light colors, alternatively light and dark colors, it gives you a contrast. But repeatedly giving a light color and contrast, dark color on whole surface area may not be visually appealing. At that time, the architect takes his decision of how much spread a dark color has to be and how much spread a light color has to be. So by balancing the area of coverage of light color with the area of coverage of the dark color, the architect gets a balance, creating a contrast in color. So contrast with the solids and voids, contrast of forms, curvilinear or linear, contrast of color. So you can create contrast by different ways. Ultimately, contrast, even though that literally it is a contrast, visually it will create a balance in look. If you see, with respect to these creative principles, if a person who is interested more knowing the architectural features from starting from the traditional historical monuments from Gothic architecture, Greek architecture, Roman architecture, Parliament building, White House, Empire State Building, Royal Halls, Gateway of India, Eiffel Tower of Paris, Taj Mahal, Qutub Minar, Hanging Gardens. Wherever these creative principles are blended in different fashions, by which each is excelling and competing with the other. It has got its own unique architectural appeal. That is the advantage. Even though the point, line, plane, and solids are used in all these things, they give you a visual feeling by which you get a difference in architecture, which is highly visually appealing and acceptable to people. They have different renderings, artistic paintings, wall mountings, lighting arrangements. Light and shades are another components, elements, which can be used. So light and shades, after color rendering, an architect has to give importance to the lights and shades. The light and shades together are called luminaire. So the luminaire system, such as chandeliers, hanging lights with so many leaves, so many branches, they play a very important role in ultimately the interior and the exterior of a building. When a person who is inside a building and looks the outside, the landscape, it is called the aspect. The view you get from inside to outside is called aspect, and the view a person gets from the outside about the building, including the interior, from the outside, that is called the prospect. So there are two attributes in architecture. One is the aspect, another is called the prospect. Thank you. God bless.